Hello, all. So, what I want to do today is just give you kind of an overview of some of the historical references in Gilead and kind of explain what they mean so you have a context for the story that you are reading right now, particularly the religious context, of course. So, first thing that might need reviewing here is John Ames is a Congregationalist minister. And if you recall from class last week, Congregationalism is the denomination that originates with the New England Puritans. So the Puritans kind of become the Congregationalists. And what distinguishes Congregationalism from other Christian denominations, Protestant denominations, is first of all that they were influenced by Calvinism and Reformism. So we've seen some evidence of John Ames's Calvinism already in this discussion in the last section with Jack Boughton about predestination. And also some of his discussion of Calvin. He says that Calvin's Institutes is one of one of his favorite books. What also it distinguishes it is that it's now very, very small. Okay, so only about 0.5% of U.S. adults are affiliated with Congregationalism. So it remains a pretty tiny religion, and actually, one of the more progressive or one of the more liberal today Protestant denominations in the United States. So, what also distinguishes it from other denominations is the model of church governance. So, in a lot of Protestant denominations like Methodism or the Baptist denomination, you have like a national convention or kind of a national body that does things like ordain ministers and assign ministers to different churches. So, if you're a Methodist minister, you'll get your assignment from some central body that will tell you what town you're going to go and what church you're going to go be a minister in. Congregationalism doesn't do that. Each church is independent. So there's not a national congregationalist organization. Each church is independent, and each church elects essentially its own minister. So, and that's a practice that actually goes back to the original Puritans. They would elect their ministers to serve them, and also because of that church model, the ministers are also paid by their congregation, paid through their donations and through funds set up to support the church. And so that means that many Congregationalist ministers tend to be rather poor, don't have a whole lot of money because the support that their congregations can provide obviously varies. And John Ames is living in a very small town in Iowa that, as we have seen, has gone through some very difficult times. And so he obviously doesn't have a whole lot. Congregationalists also differ from other denominations because of some ritual practices, like they do baptize infants, which is inherited from the Anglican tradition, but is rejected by like the Baptist tradition and other Protestant denominations. Historically, like I said, Congregationalism tends to be one of the more liberal or more progressive denominations. Historically, Congregationalists have been associated with major social movements. The most relevant for us right now, of course, is the abolitionist movement, which we've seen feature heavily in this novel so far. They were also heavily involved in the temperance movement. Temperance is the anti-alcohol movement, so the movement that led to prohibition. So when you see John Ames talking about drinking his brandy that was prescribed by his doctor, because this is the 1950s, drinking his brandy in the pantry where nobody else can see him, that's kind of where this comes from, is this temperance tradition within the Congregationalist denomination. This idea that it's wrong or even sinful to drink, or at least that it's unseemly for a minister to be seen drinking. Also involved in the women's suffrage movement, though that's not featured here, of course, as heavily. So the town of Gilead, Iowa, is actually based on a real town called Tabor, Iowa. And it's mentioned that there is a local college in Gilead, and this is based on Tabor College, which you see pictured here. So Tabor, Iowa was founded by three abolitionist ministers in 1852. And John Ames's grandfather is actually based on John Todd, who was one of these ministers and who himself was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So as you've seen already, a lot of these towns in the Midwest were set up explicitly in order to promote abolitionism and to facilitate the freeing of slaves. I'll say more about that in just a minute. Tabor College is now defunct. It doesn't exist anymore, by the way, but this again is the college that is discussed here in the book. Tabor, Iowa also supported John Brown, who I will say more about in just a few minutes. And this town also housed German prisoners during the Second World War. Um, you may have seen this reference in that section that I highlighted for one of the questions for last Thursday. In addition to these older men, like John's grandfather, being like Hebrew prophets, etc., it talks about how they had been to Lane and Oberlin. And the idea here is that these were religious men, these were ministers who had been heavily influenced by the politics of these seminaries that were also founded in these small Midwestern towns with explicitly abolitionist beliefs. So Lane Seminary was a Presbyterian seminary that was the epicenter of a controversy over slavery in the 1830s, in which like the seminary essentially split between radical abolitionist students and the rest. The students who left wound up going to Oberlin College. You might have heard of Oberlin College before. It's still like a very prestigious small liberal arts college in Iowa. And in particularly, even today, it's still known for having somewhat radical politics. So for being kind of on the forefront of major social movements. So it was founded in 1833 in the context of the Second Great Awakening and, of course, radical abolitionism. So these seminary institutions get started with these kind of in this explicitly political context in which the people who were founding them and the students who were going to them wanted to be there in order to pursue the goals of the abolitionists. It also talks about how these men who were of men and women who were of the generation of John's grandfather were free soilers. And this is a reference to something that happened um, in the middle of the 19th century, just before the Civil War. We talked about it a little bit already, but let me kind of give you the overview here. All right, so in 1850, there was a law passed called the Missouri Compromise. And this was the law that basically determined that as new states were added to the Union, because again, like most of this western part of the country was unorganized territory. Okay, it wasn't, there was no kind of real official governance over it. There were no state governments or anything like that. So this is all unorganized territory. And the Missouri Compromise that determined that as new states were added to the Union from these Western territories, that slavery would not go north of modern day Oklahoma. So the Missouri Compromise line is shown here in the middle in the middle of the map, kind of on the western side. So you can see it kind of cutting through the territory of New Mexico and then coming over the top of Texas. So this is the Missouri Compromise line, and it said that basically slavery would not go north of this point. Any new states that were added north of this line would be free states. And this was a compromise that was reached in order to kind of, again, broker yet another settlement between the anti-slavery North and the pro-slavery South. Then, in 1854, another law was passed, and this law superseded the Missouri Compromise. This is a law known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what it determined is that rather than placing a geographical boundary on slavery, instead, as new states were added, the people in those states would get to vote and decide whether their state would enter the Union as a free state or as a slave state. Okay, so at this time, the reason it's called the Kansas-Nebraska Act is because at this time, Kansas and Nebraska were both being settled by European American settlers from the East and were looking to enter the Union in the course of the next decade. And this law was basically, and what that did is it threatened to upset the balance between slave and free states by adding two more free states. In particular, Kansas's neighbor over here in Missouri was upset about potentially being surrounded, as you can see, on three sides by free states, which would potentially facilitate the escape of enslaved people, and also would mean that it's just increasing pressure on what they would call their way of life. This again threatens the political balance between slave and free states and sets off a major conflict in that region. Because the status of these new states was to be decided by popular sovereignty, and because the population of these areas was very, very low, it meant that if you could get a whole bunch of people out there to settle and establish themselves, register themselves as voters, then you could potentially shift the outcome one way or the other. So, what happened is that in the 1850s, you had a whole bunch of New England abolitionists, including a bunch of Congregationalist ministers, pick up and move to Kansas in order to establish residency and become voters, and to vote for Kansas to enter the Union as a free state. And so that's all these people who helped found the town of Tabor, Iowa, also. And it's also, this is the background, this is the context for John Ames's grandfather. He and his generation would have been the people who did this. So who picked up, so John Ames's grandfather is from Maine, which is way up in the Northeast, way up in New England. And so they would have picked up their entire lives and moved their family all the way to Kansas, which again, if we go back and look at this map, you'll see is a very great distance. Maine is all the way up here in the top right corner, and Kansas is all the way in the middle. So moving their family more than 1,000 miles in order to promote the cause of abolition. So in order to ensure that Kansas is a free state when it enters the Union. And that's why they get the name Free Soilers. At the same time, you have these pro-slavery Missourians. So Missouri, which again is a slave state, has the potential to be surrounded on three sides by free states. Missourians basically do the same thing. They're just next door, so they're able to cross the border in order to, again, try to establish residency and to try to therefore elect sympathetic representatives. So there's this conflict emerges between these New England abolitionists who were moving all the way across the country and these pro-slavery Missourians who are doing basically the same thing. So this gets so intense that by 1855, you actually have two governments in Kansas. In 1855, the pro-slavery government based over in the western part of the state, in a town that doesn't really, Le Condorcet, that doesn't really, it's not really a big city anymore. Kansas adopts Missouri's slave code, okay? So including the death penalty or hard labor for assisting fugitive slaves. It's important to understand what these people in the book who were building tunnels and doing all these things in order to help slaves escape up to Canada. It's important to understand what they were actually risking, which is that they were risking death. You could actually be killed, executed for assisting in the flight of fugitive slaves. So in 1855, Kansas's pro-slavery legislature adopts Missouri's slave code. And in response, the Northerners go and set up their own free state movement located in Lawrence, Kansas, which now is a somewhat major city adjacent to Kansas City, which is actually in Missouri. I know that's confusing, but just go look at a map. They set up their own free state government. And so basically, Kansas has two governments. It's like that brief period in European history when there were like three popes or something like that. There's two state governments in Kansas, one of them pro-slavery and one of them free. And so, you have obviously quite a legitimacy crisis going on here. So this historical period known as Bleeding Kansas refers to the time when this gets really unpleasant, when this gets nasty, when this conflict that is previously political gets violent. One thing it's important to understand is that these abolitionists who moved to Kansas aren't necessarily doing it because they support civil rights for African Americans, okay? They want to get rid of slavery. But one of the plausible reasons that one could want to get rid of slavery is because they thought that slavery was like degrading actually to the people who held the slaves. That it not only immiserated the enslaved person, him or herself, but that it also resulted in the moral downfall, like the moral degradation of the slave owner. And there was also kind of a racist idea that it was promoting unnatural contact between two races. And so, for many of these people, and so just to clarify that it's not always unambiguously one good side, one bad side, good versus evil, although, of course, many of them definitely understood it this way. But many of these white abolitionists who were moving to Kansas wanted to see Kansas become a free state because they didn't want any Black people in Kansas. Okay, so like a cartoon like this is suggesting that the Missouri adjacent government pro-slavery government in Kansas is forcing slavery, pictured here as an actual enslaved person, down the throat of a free soiler. So being an abolitionist did not definitively make you not racist. It just meant that you did not believe in slavery. So that's an important thing to understand, and it's an important thing to understand with the book, is that just because these people have sort of abolitionist roots does not mean that they're supportive of civil rights or that they don't harbor some racist sentiments. Okay, this is going to be important going forward. And we've already seen a little bit of a reference to this in what happened to, as John Ames calls it, but this is an antiquated term, the Negro Church. Okay, so we understand that the Black church in Gilead has burned down, we presume by arson. And so, or that somebody attempted to set fire to the Black church, not that it actually burned down. So again, abolitionism and anti-racism did not always go hand in hand. Okay, so in 1856, you began to see gangs of Missourians crossing the border into Kansas, which right now it's about a 45-minute drive from the Kansas border to Lawrence. So somebody on horseback could have gotten there in a day or so. So you start to see these raids in which Missouri gangs will go into Kansas in order to try to start some stuff, in order to try to make some trouble, because this alternative government, of course, has been set up in Lawrence. And the abolitionists in Kansas don't take it lying down. They begin to retaliate, so running raids back over the other side of the border into Missouri. And these abolitionists were led by a man named John Brown, who you've already heard referenced in the book at this point, that the grandfather may have killed a Union soldier in order to facilitate the escape of John Brown. So I said this is a violent conflict. It isn't super violent. In the end, 55 people in total died in this conflict. When you compare that to the Civil War, where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands people die in the conflict, it seems very, very small. But Bleeding Kansas is often seen as kind of one of the first battles of the Civil War. Here, a few years before the Civil War actually gets started. But nevertheless, we kind of see already that people are willing to kill each other and willing to die in the cause of this dispute, for their various causes on either side of this dispute. In 1859, finally, Kansas drafts a free state constitution. And in 1861, Kansas enters the Union as a free state. And then in, basically less than a year after that, the Civil War breaks out. Okay, so John Brown. Again, we've seen John Brown already, or not seen him exactly, but seen him referenced. Again, one of the formative experiences of John Ames's father's childhood was when he basically caught his father, John Ames's grandfather, helping members of John Brown's gang escape, harboring some of their injured in his church, using his church actually for this purpose, and then helping them escape and covering their escape, presumably by murdering a Union soldier. So John Brown is a really fascinating figure in U.S. history, and he's not that well known anymore. There's a song, which I'll show you in a second, and I will link on Canvas, that I think most people kind of know, but most people don't know what it's about. John Brown is a fascinating person, and he's associated with the grandfather in this book. And I also think that to a certain extent, Marilyn Robinson bases the grandfather a little bit on John Brown, because John Brown shares a lot of the grandfather's convictions and also this absolute intensity. You can kind of see from this image, he looks like there's fire in his eyes, and he has kind of wild hair. He was a very intense man and a person of very, very deep conviction. So John Brown, as you might have guessed, is an abolitionist who advocated armed insurrection in order to overthrow slavery. So it's important to understand that prior to the 1850s, the cause of abolition had primarily been a nonviolent one. So you mostly had people writing pamphlets, or in the case of Harriet Beecher Stowe, writing a novel, and basically trying to persuade people that slavery is wrong. You had societies that were set up to try to liberate slaves and then send them back to Africa, since that's where most of them came from. And in fact, like a new nation was created. The nation of Liberia was actually originally set up in order to have a place where formerly enslaved people from North America could go and establish their own country. Again, this is partly influenced by this idea that what's wrong about slavery is that it encourages Black and white people to interact with one another and live alongside each other. So there's some racist elements to this as well. John Brown departs very markedly from this long-standing nonviolent tradition. He sees slavery as the war of the strong against the weak, and he sees slavery as an inherently violent institution that can only be overthrown by violence. And this and also sees himself as called by God in order to participate in this war, in order to try to bring the war to an end by advancing the violent overthrow of slavery. John Brown is also different from many of his contemporaries in that he did support civil rights for African Americans. So one of his formative experiences was going into a slave state and staying in the house of somebody and seeing a young man who was the same age as him beaten for really nothing whatsoever. And he was horrified by this, especially because he had kind of become friends with this young man and understood that this young man was absolutely as intelligent as he was. And so he was morally horrified by it, and wanted and pursued the cause of anti-slavery because he saw enslaved people as just as human as he was and as just as entitled to human rights as he was. And the failure of the country to recognize that as a horrible, horrible sin. So this was also influenced by John Brown's very, very deep religious convictions. So there is a really close relationship here between Protestant Christianity and the abolitionist cause. So John Brown's, in addition to kind of leading all of these counter raids, these counter assaults in Missouri, as part of the Bleeding Kansas incident, John Brown's sort of most famous attempt to start this armed uprising was in 1859 when he led an attack on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where there was a federal armory, not army. So a place where they were storing weapons. And the goal was to try to seize these weapons and give them to enslaved people and start a slave uprising. And there were many men in it was a mixed race group of men that he led on this assault. But the plan was ultimately foiled, and his men were either captured or killed. And that includes two of his sons. Two of his sons were killed during this raid. And in the end, John Brown was captured and executed for treason. He was the first person in US history to be convicted of treason and executed for it. And as a result, he became essentially a martyr for the abolitionist cause. So as the Civil War gets started, Union soldiers began looking to John Brown as a kind of source of inspiration, as the first man to lead an assault against slavery and die in the pursuit of that cause. So he goes from being essentially a traitor to a martyr within the space of a couple of years. John Brown obviously is a kind of emblem of a lot of moral quandaries, a lot of moral problems associated with this period in American history, and ones that would, remain deeply rooted within American culture for a long time, moral and religious um, dilemmas. So we have, of course, the problem of what is justifiable in the pursuit of a just cause. So the formative experience of John Ames's father is understanding that his own father may have killed somebody, believing that he was doing so in order to save other people. Is that okay? Whose side are we on there? Um, John Ames's father then becomes a very committed pacifist. So he interprets his religious doctrine in a completely different way, that it is the responsibility of the Christian to avoid violence when possible. And John Ames, we see, inherits a lot of that conviction from his father. John Ames is also a very nonviolent man who believes that to kill another person is worse than being killed yourself. For the generation of John Brown and for the generation of the grandfather, the moral calculus seems very different. These were people who were pursuing a radical and, as they believed it, entirely righteous cause. And I mean, I think history has judged this to be the case. We understand the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of enslaved people as a great historical good, as an opportunity for the United States to redeem itself from this horrible, horrible mistake. But what is justified in the pursuit of that goal? Is killing other people justified? Um, and is there even a point to it? Because one of the arguments you can make about John Brown is that his sacrifice was needless. He, wanted to overthrow slavery, but at least in his own lifetime, he did not achieve that. Now, shortly after, it would be achieved, but his particular crusade, his attempt, was a failure. All that happened is he got himself, his family members, and many of the African American emancipated slaves that he had freed killed. So what do we make of that? Does it make his sacrifice pointless, or do we see him as having struck sort of a necessary early blow against slavery and showing that it was absolutely worth going to war in order to defeat slavery? So these are really big moral questions. These are big religious questions, because again, the three generations of Congregationalists in this novel are all looking at them very, very differently, based on their own particular historical moment, on the big crisis of their time, but nevertheless dealing with the same like basic body of religious doctrine, and within the same religious tradition. So these are the questions I'd really like us to take up in our discussion on Canvas, because I'm sure you guys will have many insightful things to say. So, again, the South seceded and the Civil War began a year after that raid. So you could certainly, I guess, make a strong argument for this idea that what John Brown did, even if it initially was a failure, was absolutely necessary. So as I close here, I will leave you with this song, John Brown's Body, which is sung to the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was pre-existed this particular song, but this is a song that Union soldiers would sing as they were marching, marching from place to place. So I will put a YouTube link on Canvas so that you can see that. I look forward to the discussion we're going to have on Canvas. Good luck.